The hum of the jet engines was the only sound as Morgan Wells sat in the window seat of the commercial flight. Not for the first time, she regretted not switching seats with the businessman beside her. He was irritating, constantly checking his watch and grumbling about delays, but at least his voice would drown out the constant buzz in her mind. She didn't need distractions, she needed quiet, not for comfort, but for survival. In her world, silence meant safety. The flight attendant's cheerful voice broke the stillness. "Good morning, folks. We'll be cruising at 35,000 feet for the next few hours, smooth skies ahead." Morgan didn't need the reassurance. She knew this aircraft was far from safe, and Captain Hayes's voice on the intercom barely concealed the tremor of anxiety. She could hear it, a slight crack in the otherwise smooth pitch. That was all it took. She was already alert. Her gaze shifted, scanning the cloud formations outside the window. Something wasn't right. She knew that feeling. Her military instincts kicked in. Years of service hadn't dulled them. It was only when the jets appeared, cutting through the clouds like predators, that she understood why. Two F-16s flew dangerously close, a few dozen feet away from the commercial airliner. Morgan tensed. It didn't make sense. Military escorts didn't operate like this. But these weren't escorts. They were waiting. The businessman beside her noticed the jets, leaning over her to get a better view. "What's going on?" He wasn't scared yet, didn't understand the gravity. "Sit back," she said sharply. "I'll handle it." Morgan turned her attention to the cockpit. She could hear the captain's voice crackling with a layer of unease, the sharp sound of his hurried words. A faint tremor ran through the plane as it adjusted course, steering toward restricted airspace. Morgan's heart rate increased. They were in danger, and the captain didn't even know why. When she unbuckled her seatbelt, the flight attendant blocked her path. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." The young woman's voice was firm but kind. Morgan ignored her, moving past the flight attendants and toward the front. The cockpit door was locked, and Morgan had no intention of knocking. "Captain," she said flatly, pushing the door open, "I'm coming in." Inside, Captain Hayes spun around, startled. The co-pilot, James Park, froze. Morgan didn't have time to explain herself. "Step aside," she ordered, striding past them to the jump seat. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded, his voice strained. "Someone who knows what's going on," Morgan replied, adjusting her headset. "We have a situation." Her hands flew over the radio panel. She tuned into the frequency, listening to the distress call from one of the jets. A voice, young and panicked, echoed through the cabin. "Mayday, mayday. Fuel system failure." Losing pressure, Morgan's chest tightened. The jet was in trouble, and it was her responsibility to help. "You need me in that cockpit now," she told Captain Hayes. He was about to protest, but Morgan cut him off. "I trained those pilots." The captain hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, his face pale. As she slipped the headset over her ears, Morgan closed her eyes briefly. It had been 7 years since she had been involved in anything like this. She had been buried, forgotten until now. Now she was back, not as a ghost, but as a woman with unfinished business. And if the passengers on this flight were to survive, it would be because of the skills she had hidden away for so long. She flicked on the mic. "Hawk 2, Hawk 3, this is Eagle 1. Do you copy?" The static in her ears buzzed for a few seconds before the response came. "Eagle 1, this is Hawk 3. Do you copy?" The voice on the other end was strained, barely audible over the crackling interference. Morgan's jaw tightened. It was Danny's voice, shaky but alive. "What's your status, Hawk 3? She asked, her tone cutting through the static. "Fuel's almost gone, Eagle 1, losing altitude, fast." Danny's voice was raw, panic seeping into his words. Morgan's stomach clenched. She had pushed him too hard in training. Had she failed him? No, he wasn't going down, not today. "You're not alone, Danny. Stay with me," she commanded, her voice sharper than she intended. There was a long pause before his voice returned, weak but steady. "You were supposed to be dead. Everyone said you were dead." His words hit harder than any missile. "I was," Morgan said quietly, her heart heavy. "But not anymore." She focused on the instruments in front of her. Hayes and Park were frozen, unsure of what to do as the situation spiraled out of control. But Morgan knew what she had to do. She had no choice but to guide them through this. "Look at your fuel gauge, Danny," she instructed. "You're not empty, you're panicking." She could hear him trying to slow his breathing. "Good. Throttle back, Hawk 3. Reduce speed to 70%. Glide. You've got this." "I can't. My hands won't stop shaking." His voice cracked, but Morgan didn't falter. "Hands can shake, that's fine. But you trained for this. Trust your training, trust yourself." Another pause, then he responded, calmer. "Okay, throttle back to 70%, gliding." Morgan exhaled slowly. Her hands didn't shake anymore, but her chest felt tight as if the weight of the past 7 years had come crashing down all at once. She was finally doing what she had been born to do. Her heart was steady, and for the first time in 7 years, she was back in control. But she knew they were running out of time. And the hardest part was yet to come. As she monitored Danny's progress, Morgan's thoughts wandered, but only for a moment. That's when the intercom crackled again. It was the captain's voice, strained, almost pleading. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unusual flight conditions. Please remain calm. We're adjusting course, just a minor detour." Hayes's voice quivered slightly. Morgan frowned. "Your captain is lying to you," Morgan said into the mic. "We have a serious situation up here. I'm taking control now." She glanced at the co-pilot, who stared at her wide-eyed. "What are you?" he began, but Morgan cut him off. "I'm going to save this flight. You need to trust me." She slid into the seat in front of the radio, adjusting her headset. Her fingers moved quickly, tuning frequencies, checking the radar. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. She could feel the sweat on her brow, the uncertainty. But it wasn't fear, it was focus. And now, with a plane full of passengers unaware of the danger, she had no room for hesitation. "Okay, Hawk 2, she spoke into the headset. "You're doing great. Keep it steady. Focus on my voice." The plane lurched again. This time it wasn't a trick of her imagination, it was real. "How much longer, Eagle 1? Danny asked, his voice quieter now, the tremor gone, but the tension still heavy. "We're getting close. You're not alone." She heard him take a shaky breath as he followed her instructions. "What if I can't do it?" Danny's voice broke again. "You've got this. You always have," she said, her voice firm. "And when we land, we'll talk. I'll make sure you know it wasn't your fault, but first, we get through this." Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door, where Hayes was still standing, frozen. "Keep it calm, Captain. I'm your best chance." The radio crackled again, and Morgan's pulse quickened as the voice of the second jet, Marcus Cole, came through, tight with fear. "Eagle 1, this is Hawk 3. I'm losing visuals, no GPS, nothing." His voice trembled slightly, a man used to command, now grasping for the same calm Morgan had spent years cultivating. "You know how to handle this," she said, voice steady even as her thoughts raced. She could hear the nervousness in his voice, but she wasn't about to let him break. "Follow the plane, keep it in sight, and keep your altitude steady." "Can't see anything except cloud cover," Marcus replied, frustration evident in his words. She felt her hands tighten on the controls. It wasn't just the planes she was guiding now, it was everything, the mission, the lives in her hands. And the ghosts of her past that refused to stay buried. "You've been in worse, Marcus. Keep your head. Don't lose it." She could hear him taking slow breaths through the headset, willing himself to calm down. "Focus on the airframe. Trust your instincts." She could feel the heat of the moment bearing down on her, the weight of 7 years of lies and guilt dragging at her shoulders. But she couldn't afford to think about that now, not with 187 lives hanging in the balance. The captain had been strangely silent, watching the whole exchange with wide eyes. Finally, he broke his silence, voice trembling. How do you know all of this? How can you be so sure?" Hayes was practically pleading, his voice frantic as he looked between the instruments and the woman who, until recently, had been declared dead. Morgan turned her gaze to him, her eyes cold and unblinking. "Because I trained them," she said flatly. "I made them who they are, and now I'm going to make sure they don't die." Her voice dropped lower, firm as steel. "And if you get in my way, you'll be responsible for all of it." The words settled heavily in the cockpit, and Hayes stiffened. He didn't argue. He couldn't. It was clear in his eyes that this was beyond his control now. Morgan turned back to the radio, her fingers dancing over the buttons. Hawk 2, Hawk 3, this is Eagle 1, you're not alone. Do you copy? Her voice was firm, the air calm despite the storm of chaos swirling around them. There was a brief pause before both voices came through at once. We copy. Danny's voice was steadier now. Copy, Eagle 1, Marcus chimed in, more confident than before. Morgan nodded to herself, relieved. They were stabilizing, but the next step was crucial. The emergency landing. She had to guide them to that. Maintain your altitude, slow to 150 knots and glide, she instructed, her eyes never leaving the instruments. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside her, but didn't speak again. She glanced at him once more, then back at the readouts. Her heart rate was steady now, but her mind was sharp, analyzing the situation like a machine. A smooth landing wasn't possible, not yet, but if they could make it to a controlled descent, they had a chance. Danny's voice cut through the radio again, hesitant. What if we don't make it? What if we can't get control of the situation? He wasn't just asking about the flight. His voice trembled with more than just fear of the jet's fuel and altitude running out. You're going to make it. You have to. Her words were final, absolute. She didn't give him a choice. She didn't have a choice. It wasn't just their lives on the line. It was everything she had sacrificed and buried for the last 7 years. Now slow your descent, Hawk 2, Morgan continued, her voice returning to the calm tone that had guided her students so many years ago. You can do this. Her eyes closed for a moment, remembering a time when Danny had been a raw recruit, unpolished but full of potential. He had always been able to rise to the challenge. The seconds dragged by, each one heavy with the tension of uncertainty. As they glided through the sky, Morgan's thoughts wandered, briefly, to the life she had built away from the military. A life she was now questioning. But there was no room for self-doubt now. She was back for a reason. Okay, Marcus, Danny, she said, the weight of the moment hanging in her words. We're coming in for an emergency landing. I'm going to guide you to safety, but you need to trust me. And you need to do exactly as I say. No hesitation. The silence on the other end was telling. Then Danny's voice came through, strong and sure, the kind of voice that came from a pilot who had earned his wings through blood, sweat, and hard work. Understood, Eagle 1, we trust you. The aircraft seemed to shudder as it descended, and Morgan's focus narrowed to the sound of the engines struggling to maintain power. Her hand hovered over the controls, ensuring everything was stable, her mind calculating every moment of their descent. The passenger cabin was eerily quiet, save for the occasional whisper or muffled sob. Morgan could hear the faint sound of the airframe groaning under pressure, but her attention was elsewhere. The jet's engines sputtered again, an ominous sound that made her jaw clench. She looked at the co-pilot, who was still frozen in his seat, eyes wide with terror. He had no idea what to do. Morgan did. She turned back to the radio. Hawk 2, Hawk 3, status. Her voice cut through the tension, sharp and steady. Danny here. Gliding, but fuel's still low. We've got about 5 minutes before we lose power. Understood, Morgan said, her mind racing. Marcus, you still with me? The radio crackled briefly before Marcus responded, his voice laced with uncertainty. Yeah, Eagle 1, I'm here. Good, both of you. Prepare for a controlled crash landing. There's a highway about 10 miles east. I'm going to guide you in. Keep your altitude steady. You've got this. Her words were firm, but inside her heart hammered against her chest. They had little time, and the odds were growing slimmer by the second. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, save for the sound of Morgan's voice as she issued calm, calculated orders. But she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her now. They had no idea what was happening, but the nervous energy in the air was palpable. She glanced at the cabin door, knowing the crew would have to face the fallout once this was over. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. Okay, Hawk 3, you're going to need to start your descent now, she said, taking a breath and pushing her own fear aside. Remember what I taught you. Slow it down. Keep steady. Danny's voice responded, tense but focused. I'm descending. Fuel is almost gone, but I can still glide. Good, Morgan replied, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the control panel as she followed the aircraft's progress. Now, reduce throttle by 10%. We don't want to burn any more fuel unnecessarily. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she guided the two planes through the sky. She could hear the faint sound of the aircraft's engines sputtering more frequently, and each time her heart raced a little faster. But she couldn't afford to let fear dictate her actions. Not now. "Danny, Marcus, do you have the highway in sight?" Morgan asked, her voice tense. "I think I see it," Danny responded, his voice wavering slightly. "It's not exactly a runway." "It'll have to do," Morgan replied, her voice flat. "You don't have a choice." She shifted slightly in her seat, preparing herself for what was to come. This was the moment everything would either come together or fall apart. The wind outside howled, buffeting the aircraft, and Morgan could feel the strain on the airframe. "Keep it together," she muttered under her breath. She couldn't afford to let the fear win now. She turned to the cockpit window once more, staring out into the abyss. The highway was visible in the distance now, a narrow stretch of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. The ground was approaching far too quickly for comfort. "Danny, slow it down," Morgan instructed. "You're approaching too fast." Her heart raced in time with the aircraft's descent. The seconds felt like an eternity. There was a moment of complete silence before the engines roared back to life, faltering but still there. She glanced at the altimeter, 2,000 feet and dropping fast. "Marcus, adjust your course slightly, 2 degrees to the right. Danny, you're almost there." Her words felt like the final countdown. She could see the lights of the highway now, the cars scattered in traffic, unaware of the impending disaster above them. "Danny, prepare for impact," Morgan shouted, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. "Flaps down, gear down." Her hands flew over the controls, adjusting as best as she could in the chaos. It was happening, and there was no turning back now. The F-16 dipped low, dangerously close to the ground, its wings shaking violently as it approached the highway at a terrifying speed. "Danny," Morgan shouted again, urgency in her voice. "You have one shot at this." She could feel the sweat pouring down her neck, the tension in her chest tightening like a vice. "Make it count." Suddenly, a sharp pull on the throttle as Danny steadied the plane. The engine sputtered once more, but the nose of the jet dipped, pointing toward the asphalt just below. A final, terrifying second passed before Danny's voice came through the radio, strong and determined. "I've got it. I'm landing." The roar of the engines faded into the background as Morgan's eyes stayed locked on the approaching highway. Danny's voice crackled in her earpiece, steady yet full of the weight of the moment. "Eagle 1, I'm coming in." The seconds felt like hours. She couldn't afford to blink, couldn't let up for a single moment. Every movement needed to be perfect. "You've got this," she said, her voice low and commanding. The words she had spoken so many times to others were now directed at herself as much as at Danny. The ground was rushing up to meet them, and Morgan's pulse quickened. "Focus on the center line. Don't veer off," Morgan instructed, her grip tight on the control panel, even though it was no longer necessary. Her job was done. She had guided him here. "Flaps down, airspeed slowing." Danny's voice was sharp, professional. He was ready. They were ready. Suddenly, the F-16's tires hit the pavement with a violent jolt, sending a shockwave through the entire aircraft. Morgan's stomach lurched as the plane bounced, tires screeching against the asphalt. The noise was deafening, the sensation of metal scraping against tarmac almost overwhelming. But she could hear the sound of Danny's steady breathing through the earpiece, the plane's wings stabilizing. "Good job, Danny. Keep it straight." Morgan's voice was calm, despite the chaos unfolding in front of her. The F-16 skidded along the highway, tires screeching as sparks flew from the belly of the jet. It wasn't graceful, but it was happening. The impossible was unfolding before her eyes. Danny's breathing grew heavier, but there was an undeniable sense of accomplishment in his voice. "I'm slowing down, coming to a stop." The jet finally screeched to a halt, its nose pointing toward the empty highway. A wave of relief washed over Morgan, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. "Great job," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. She felt her body loosen for the first time in hours. They had done it. But there was no time for celebration. Not yet. "Make sure you stay low," Morgan continued, turning her attention back to the other plane, now only a few miles out. She knew what was coming, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. In the distance, she saw Marcus's plane, dipping low as it prepared to follow Danny's lead. She adjusted the radio and spoke into it, her voice steady, no hesitation. "Marcus, you're up. Follow the same path." "Roger that, Eagle One," Marcus responded, his voice tinged with the same professionalism Morgan had come to expect. There was no room for fear anymore. They had all made it this far, and now it was their turn to land. Morgan adjusted her seat, eyes fixed on the two planes below her. She could hear the sound of the other F-16's engines roaring as it descended. The same sound that had filled the cabin just moments before. The chaos of the skies had finally settled. "Now, slow it down," she said into the mic, her gaze scanning the landscape. Her mind was already calculating the next steps. "Altitude's dropping," Marcus said, his voice even, though she could sense the adrenaline still running high. She glanced out the cockpit window. The ground was getting closer, but this time there was a sense of purpose behind it. She was no longer just surviving. She was in control. "Good, you're doing great. Now aim for the center of the highway," Morgan said, offering her final guidance before he landed. "Just like Danny." The radio crackled briefly as Marcus's voice came through once more. "I've got the center line." She watched through the window, eyes narrowed as the aircraft descended steadily toward the highway. This time, everything felt different. The chaos of the moment had faded, replaced by a steady focus that only military training could provide. Marcus's tires hit the pavement with a sharp jolt, the plane bouncing slightly before it steadied itself on the highway. A small cheer from the back of her mind erupted as she spoke into the mic, her voice a little less controlled but filled with pride. "Great landing, Marcus." The two planes, both now safely on the ground, their engines sputtering out, brought a sense of peace to Morgan that she hadn't known in years. She exhaled slowly, finally allowing herself to relax as she switched the radio frequency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're safe," she said, addressing the cabin for the first time. The passengers had no idea what had just happened, what she had just done. But they would get their lives back. The air would no longer be thick with tension. The sound of emergency vehicles in the distance grew louder. The military personnel had arrived. They would take care of the aftermath. Morgan turned to the cockpit door, ready to face whatever questions came next. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of guilt or fear. She had done it. She had brought them all home. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that maybe she could too. The sound of tires rolling across pavement slowly faded as the emergency vehicles approached, their sirens cutting through the night air. Morgan sat still, her hands resting on the arms of her seat, her eyes focused ahead. It was over, but not yet over. There would be questions, investigations, and no shortage of red tape. But none of that mattered. She had done her job. She had brought them all down safely. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, the tension in her muscles finally starting to give way. The cockpit was still filled with a quiet energy, a residual hum of the adrenaline that had carried them all through the ordeal. Captain Hayes was already speaking into his radio, coordinating with ground control, though his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. Morgan could hear the tremor in his words now, relief mingled with disbelief. She took one last glance at the window. Two jets, both on the ground, engines cooling. Her heart still raced, but there was something else, something like peace slowly settling within her. It had been years since she'd felt this way, alive, grounded, part of something larger than herself. The moment stretched out, her thoughts turning inward as the cockpit door opened and the first of the emergency responders rushed in. Morgan stood up, brushing off the dust from her flight suit, and turned to face them. A pair of military officers stepped into the cockpit, eyes scanning the scene before locking on her. One of them was younger, his face a mix of awe and confusion. The other, an older man with grey hair and a heavy-set jaw, stepped forward first. "Captain Wells?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Morgan simply nodded. "Glad to see you in one piece," he added, his voice steady but not without a hint of respect. He glanced at his younger colleague. "Get the captain to debrief, we'll handle the rest." Morgan moved past him, her boots heavy on the cockpit floor, but her shoulders squared, her posture firm. The memories of the years spent hiding from her past, of running from her true identity, didn't seem so heavy now. She had carried them, but they didn't own her anymore. The younger officer followed her down the aisle, the weight of his gaze settling on her. I didn't think... He stopped himself, clearly unsure of how to finish his sentence. What? Morgan asked, not unkindly. I didn't think... You'd be real. After everything they said, the officer looked away, embarrassed. Morgan felt her lips twitch into a small smile. I wasn't, not for a long time, but I am now. She didn't wait for his reply, instead making her way toward the back of the cabin. The passengers were already being ushered out by the crew, some looking relieved, others still too stunned to react. She moved through the crowd, unnoticed, just another person among many. It wasn't until she reached the cabin door that she felt it. A steady hand on her shoulder. She turned to find a familiar face. Chloe, the young flight attendant, who had been so kind earlier, her face pale but still holding that familiar smile. You saved us all, Chloe said softly, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Morgan just nodded, her throat tight for a moment. The weight of the moment was still pressing down on her, but there was also something else now. Gratitude. I did what had to be done, Morgan said, her voice steady. But it's not over, it never is. The young attendant stepped aside, her expression thoughtful, as Morgan moved past her. Outside, the ground was covered with emergency response teams, a mix of military personnel and local authorities. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, but the bright lights from the vehicles illuminated the scene, creating a sense of surreal finality. Morgan took a deep breath and adjusted her flight suit. She didn't look back as she moved toward the tarmac, the familiar weight of her aviator wings a reminder of who she was, who she had always been. The black SUVs were already waiting, their engines running, and she knew what would come next. Cross, the man from the intelligence agency, would want to speak with her, but this time she wasn't afraid. You all right? A familiar voice came from behind her. She turned to find Danny and Marcus standing together, both looking at her with a mix of concern and admiration. Morgan nodded. Yeah, I'm all right. She paused, her eyes meeting theirs. You two did well. Danny gave a half smile, his eyes still full of the intensity of the past few hours. We were just following orders. No, Morgan corrected, her voice quiet but firm. You did more than that. You saved lives. She walked toward the waiting vehicles, the two men falling in step beside her, their presence a silent testament to the bonds they had formed in the chaos. There was no fanfare, no parade, but in that moment, Morgan Wells finally felt whole again. She was back, not just as a ghost of the past, but as a woman with a future. As they climbed into the SUV, Morgan leaned back, eyes closing for just a moment. The world was moving forward, and for the first time in years, she was ready to face whatever came next. The doors closed, and the vehicle pulled away from the tarmac. In the distance, the aircraft she had saved still stood, a symbol of the lives she had touched, the risks she had taken. But it wasn't over. Not yet. She opened her eyes, her gaze steady and sure. We have work to do. The ride to the briefing room was quiet, the weight of the mission settling in as the vehicle sped through the base. The roads were familiar, though the place felt different now, as if the air itself had changed. Morgan's thoughts drifted to the conversations she had yet to have, the people she would face, and the long road ahead. Danny and Marcus sat beside her, both quiet, lost in their own thoughts. Danny's gaze was fixed ahead, his jaw tight, while Marcus absent-mindedly ran his fingers over his weapon. They hadn't said much since leaving the plane. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't the kind that felt uncomfortable. It was the kind forged by shared experience, by survival. The SUV came to a halt in front of a nondescript building. Cross was already waiting outside, his figure stiff and distant, as though the air around him had thickened in anticipation of what was coming. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Let's move, he said, his voice flat, every word measured. We don't have much time. Morgan led the way, stepping out of the vehicle with the grace of someone who had seen too much, felt too much. Her boots hit the pavement with a purposeful rhythm. Inside, the briefing room was stark and functional, walls lined with monitors displaying a mix of data, images, and reports. It wasn't a room for comfort. It was a room for business. Cross gestured for her to take a seat, but Morgan remained standing, her posture commanding. Her gaze swept over the room, then back to him. I'm here. Let's get to it. Cross gave a curt nod, Clicking a button on a nearby console, the screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying an aerial map of the area surrounding the Richmond warehouse. On it, red dots marked the positions of hostile forces. Morgan studied the screen with a practiced eye. She had seen these kinds of maps before, ones that represented the lives of people she couldn't afford to care about. "We know Harrison is moving fast," Cross said, his tone even. "The intel we've gathered shows he's not acting alone. There's a network of arms dealers connected to him, and we need to find out how deep it goes." Morgan's gaze never wavered from the screen. "And what do you expect from me?" she asked. Cross's lips thinned. "I expect you to finish what you started. You know the people involved. You know the operation. I need you to lead this." He paused, then added, "And I need you to trust your team." She knew what he meant. Danny and Marcus. The men who had been by her side when the chips were down. The ones who had followed her, trusted her, despite everything. But trust didn't come easily to Morgan. Not anymore. The world had broken her trust long ago. But she didn't have a choice. She nodded once, her expression hardening. "We'll need more intel. The rest of the team can track Harrison's movements, but I need direct access to the data." Cross hesitated. "We don't have time to dig too deep. The operation's going down fast. We move on Harrison tonight." "Fine," Morgan replied, her voice cold. "Give me everything. We won't miss." Cross stepped back, his eyes narrowing. He didn't respond immediately, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he knew this wasn't just another mission for Morgan. This was personal. "Get your team ready," he said finally. "We leave in 3 hours." As Cross turned to leave, Morgan turned to Danny and Marcus. They had already been briefed, but there was something else in the air now, something unspoken. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. Danny was the first to speak. "What's the plan?" His voice was steady, but the weariness in his eyes betrayed the toll of the past hours. Morgan looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "We go in, we find Harrison, and we shut it all down. We don't give them a chance to regroup." Her voice was quiet, but the weight of her words hung in the air. "And we make sure he never hurts anyone again." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I'll follow you, wherever." The sincerity in his voice didn't go unnoticed. Morgan had always known they were loyal, but there was something deeper now, something that had been forged in the fire of the past hours. And as much as she hated to admit it, she felt the same way. These men had become her family, her responsibility. "We do this together," Morgan said, her voice firm. The door to the briefing room opened, and a team of operatives filed in, their expressions serious, their uniforms impeccable. They were ready. But Morgan's mind wasn't on them, it was on the task ahead, on the man who had spent 7 years hiding the truth from her. She walked toward the team, ready to make her plans clear. As she did, Danny's voice caught her attention once more. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Morgan paused, her back still turned to him. She didn't have an answer. She didn't need one. She was here. She was alive. And for the first time in 7 years, she had a purpose that didn't involve running. "Let's get to work," she said simply. And with that, the doors to the next chapter of their mission closed behind them. The night was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. Morgan stood at the front of the operations room, her eyes scanning the data on the screens, her mind already 2 steps ahead. The team was gearing up for the raid, but Morgan knew that the hardest part was still ahead. "We've got 10 minutes, Cross's voice came through the comms, cutting through the noise of the room. "Are you ready, Captain?" The words were loaded with more than just the usual protocol. Morgan could hear the slight hesitation in his voice, the unspoken understanding that this wasn't just another operation. "Always," Morgan replied, her voice flat, her gaze steady as she adjusted her gear. She had done this 1,000 times before, but this time the stakes were personal. Harrison, the man who had destroyed her career, her reputation, was out there, somewhere in the night. He had to be stopped. The team was already positioned. Danny and Marcus had been briefed in detail, but she had left nothing to chance. They would move fast, no hesitation. The plan was simple, but its execution would be anything but. "We take the compound, secure the intel, and get Harrison, no one else." Morgan's orders were concise. She didn't need to explain any further. The team knew the drill. It wasn't about heroes tonight. It was about survival. About justice. You and your team are clear to go, Cross said, his voice cutting through her thoughts as the clock ticked down. We'll back you up from the perimeter. Morgan gave him a single nod. Understood. Her hand reached for the weapon at her side, adjusting it one last time. This was it. They moved out into the night, the air sharp with the cold as they made their way to the vehicles. The hum of the engines, the flickering lights of the security posts, and the distant sound of footsteps were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. It was a calculated, controlled kind of silence, one that Morgan had mastered in her years of service. But this wasn't just a mission anymore, it was personal. As they arrived at the compound, the team deployed, taking their positions around the perimeter. Morgan's eyes never left the building ahead. Every detail, every movement had been planned for this. But she knew better than to believe everything would go as planned. Not in her world. Not anymore. On me, Morgan whispered into the comms, signaling Danny and Marcus to move. The trio advanced, their boots light but purposeful on the gravel path leading to the compound's entrance. The building loomed ahead, its exterior dark and quiet. But Morgan knew better. The silence was deceptive. They had to move fast. With one swift motion, she drew her weapon and kicked open the door, stepping into the compound with deadly precision. The team followed, covering each other's blind spots as they moved deeper inside. The air was thick with tension, but Morgan's focus never wavered. Clear, Danny muttered over the comms, his voice barely audible. But his presence felt. He was close. They all were. They reached the central room where the control system was housed. The monitors flickered with activity, but the room was eerily quiet, save for the sound of their breathing. Morgan's eyes scanned the room, mentally ticking off the steps. "We're in," Marcus confirmed, his voice calm but sharp with the intensity of the mission. Morgan stepped forward, her mind racing as she approached the control system. She knew the layout of the technology. She had helped design it. This wasn't just about taking Harrison down. It was about taking back control of the system that had once been hers. "Get it done," she ordered, her voice cold and commanding. She didn't have to tell them twice. They knew what they had to do. As the team worked to access the data, the tension in the room mounted. But it wasn't just the technology that mattered, it was the man who had engineered this chaos. The man who had manipulated everything. And suddenly, Morgan felt a presence behind her. "You won't get away with this." Harrison's voice was low, but filled with the venom of someone who had been cornered. Morgan froze for a split second, then turned around slowly. There he was, standing in the doorway, his posture arrogant, his expression one of twisted satisfaction. The bastard had been watching them all along. "I already have," Morgan replied, her voice icy. The years of guilt, the years of fear, the years of hiding, all of it boiled over in that one moment. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Harrison spat, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're nothing, Wells. Always have been. You're just a tool, a pawn." Morgan stepped closer, her weapon raised slightly. "You're wrong, Harrison." Her words were calm but deadly. "I'm no one's pawn, and you? You're finished." Before Harrison could react, Morgan's team moved swiftly, taking control of the room. The perimeter was secure, the mission was as good as complete. But Morgan's eyes never left Harrison's. His threats, his smugness, it didn't matter. It wasn't just the operation she was shutting down. It was the man who had taken everything from her. She gave the signal. The team moved in. As the cuffs clicked around Harrison's wrists, Morgan finally felt the release she had been waiting for. This was the end. The beginning of the end. And the moment she had waited for, where the ghosts of her past were finally put to rest. "It's over," Morgan said, her voice steady. She could hear the echo of her words in the stillness of the room. And for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. But it wasn't about victory, not anymore. She turned to the control system, watching as the last pieces of iron sky were deactivated. The drones were no longer a threat, but neither was Harrison. Not anymore. "Get him out of here," she said flatly. The team moved to comply, dragging Harrison toward the door. Morgan stayed behind, her gaze lingering on the flickering monitors one last time. "Let's go," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. Morgan didn't reply, but she followed him out of the room. As they left the compound, the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. They had won. And now, for the first time in years, Morgan Wells was free. The ride back to the base was a quiet one. Morgan sat in the back of the SUV, her eyes focused on the road ahead. But her thoughts were elsewhere. The mission was over. Harrison was in custody. The network had been disrupted, but there was still a lingering weight on her chest, something she couldn't shake. Danny and Marcus sat across from her, both quiet, their expressions unreadable. They had done their part, and Morgan knew how much this had cost them. But she had been the one to pull them back into this world. The world they had left behind, the world they'd been trying to move on from. She had to find a way to explain it to them, to herself. "We did good," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but carrying the exhaustion of the night. "We got him. We got the whole thing." Morgan nodded but didn't speak. She was still too lost in her thoughts. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the weight of everything they had faced, the lies, the fear, the uncertainty, was beginning to settle in. She had been through so much, but this wasn't over. Not yet. "What now?" Danny asked, his voice quieter than usual. He wasn't asking about the mission. He was asking about her, asking about the future. Morgan let out a breath, leaning back in her seat. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice rough. "I really don't." The silence in the vehicle was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding. The kind that said there were no easy answers, no neat conclusions. "You don't have to figure it out right now," Marcus said quietly. He was always the calm one, the steady presence. "You just have to take it one step at a time." Morgan looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers. Not right now. The vehicle pulled into the base, the hum of the engine fading as they came to a stop. The first rays of the morning sun were beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft light over the tarmac. "We did what we had to do," Morgan said softly, the weight of the words sinking in. "But there's still work to be done." The doors to the SUV opened, and they stepped out onto the tarmac. The base was quiet now, but the faint hum of activity in the distance reminded them that the world hadn't stopped. Not for them, not for anyone. As they made their way toward the hangar, Morgan's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from Cross. "Operation complete. Harrison in custody. We're beginning the debriefing. You've done what no one else could." Morgan stared at the message for a long moment. It wasn't just a job. It wasn't just another mission. She had done this for herself, for the people who mattered, for the lives she had touched and the ones she had saved. She tucked her phone back into her pocket and took a deep breath. The weight was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. She wasn't carrying it alone anymore. As she walked toward the hangar, she felt the familiar weight of her aviator wings settle against her chest. The mission was over, but her work wasn't. It never really was. Danny and Marcus walked beside her, their steps in sync with hers. They didn't need to say anything. They didn't need to ask questions. They understood. "You good?" Danny asked as they reached the entrance to the hangar. Morgan paused, looking out at the tarmac for a long moment. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think I am." The hangar doors opened in front of them, and the bustle of the operations team began to fill the air. It was time to face what came next. But for the first time in years, Morgan felt ready. "We've got a lot of work to do," she said, her voice steady. "But we'll do it together." Danny and Marcus nodded, their faces filled with understanding. Together. That's how they had survived. And that's how they would keep going. As they stepped inside the hangar, the world outside seemed a little less heavy, a little more hopeful. And for the first time in 7 years, Morgan Wells allowed herself to believe that she had a future. One where she wasn't just running from her past. She had a future, and it was time to make it hers. The days following the operation passed in a blur of debriefings, paperwork, and tense meetings. Morgan had expected the weight of the world to come crashing down on her shoulders once the mission was over, but instead it was a quiet relief. The world didn't seem to change as much as she'd expected, and yet everything had shifted. The debriefing room was packed with officers and intelligence personnel, all eagerly awaiting the details of the operation. Cross was at the front, eyes scanning the room as he prepared to speak. Morgan stood to the side, her posture as firm as ever, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The weight of the past 7 years still lingered, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel insurmountable. "You did well, Captain," Cross said, his voice breaking the silence. He was standing beside the operation map, the lights from the overhead screens flickering as he spoke. "You brought down a dangerous network and stopped a global threat. For that, we owe you everything." Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't need the accolades, not anymore. She had done her duty, and that was enough. She wasn't here for praise, she was here for closure. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Cross looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We'll clean up the loose ends, tie up the investigation. Harrison's contacts are already being interrogated. As for you, we'll begin reinstating your official record. Full back pay, a promotion, and a new identity, if you want it." Morgan remained silent for a moment, processing the words. It was everything she'd wanted when she first ran, the chance to disappear, to forget. But now, she wasn't so sure. "No," she said finally, "I'm not going back to that. I'm done hiding." The room went quiet, all eyes on her. Cross's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but he didn't challenge her. "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. Morgan looked around the room at the faces of those who had worked with her, those who had come to rely on her. She could feel Danny and Marcus standing behind her, their presence a reminder of the bond they had forged in the heat of battle. And for the first time, she realized that they were her future, not the shadows of her past. "I want to teach," she said, her voice stronger now. "I want to train the next generation, not just pilots. I want to teach them what it means to truly serve, to protect, and to sacrifice." Cross didn't speak for a moment, and when he did, his tone was different. "You've earned that, Captain. You've earned more than you'll ever know." Morgan nodded, her resolve clear. She didn't need the medals, the promotions, or the recognition. She had already fought for everything that mattered. Now it was time to build something new, something that wasn't defined by her past. As the debriefing continued, Morgan felt her mind start to clear. There was work to be done, yes. But for the first time in years, she wasn't dreading it. She was ready. Later that day, after the meeting, Morgan found herself standing in front of a classroom. The walls were lined with posters, flight maps, and all the equipment that came with military training. But as Morgan stood there, looking at the faces of the young cadets sitting before her, she realized it wasn't the tools that mattered. It was the people. They were the ones who would carry the future. She took a breath, steadying herself. "My name is Captain Morgan Wells," she began, her voice steady, authoritative, "and I'm here to teach you how to be more than just pilots. I'm here to teach you how to be leaders, how to stand in the face of impossible odds and not back down. I'm here to teach you to fight for what's right, no matter the cost." Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes meeting each cadet's gaze in turn. "You will face challenges, you will face fear, you will lose people, but you will never stop, you will never quit." She paused, her throat tightening slightly. "And one day, you will be the ones who decide the future. What kind of future? That's up to you." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, she felt something inside her shift. This was where she was meant to be. Not as a ghost of the past, not as a shadow, but as a mentor, a leader, a teacher. As the class continued, Morgan stood at the front, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle comfortably on her shoulders. She wasn't hiding anymore, and as the cadets practiced their drills, Morgan Wells, Major Wells now, allowed herself a moment of peace. She had finally found her place, and she knew deep down that the fight was never truly over. But it wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about the next generation. As the day ended, Morgan walked out of the classroom, her feet steady, her gaze focused. Danny and Marcus were waiting for her outside the door, their faces soft with quiet understanding. "How'd it go?" Danny asked. "It went well," she said, her voice warm with the pride of a job well done. "Now, we start the next mission." "And what's that?" Marcus asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Morgan looked at them both, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Teaching them how to fly." They walked off the base together, the future stretching out before them like an open sky. And for the first time, Morgan Wells wasn't afraid to fly.